Hello friends, welcome to Puffs and Poetry. I'm your host, Jessica, a writer, cannabis aficionado, and poetry lover. Let's get right into it. Today I am rolling up a type 2 joint. And type 2 simply refers to the chemotype of the weed in the joint. And the chemotype is simply a classification of cannabis by its dominant cannabinoid. So a type 2 chemotype has both CBD and THC. A type 1 is all THC, a type 3 is all CBD. Pretty easy to remember. So while I roll up and struggle with this tip, let me tell you about today's poet. There we go. My goodness. Today's poet is Adrienne Rich. Adrienne was a poet of the 21st century. She was born sometime in the early to mid 1900s and died in about 2012. Adrienne is particularly famous because in addition to being a poet and an essayist, she is also a feminist, a political activist, and a lesbian. Whereas with Rumi's poems we get into spirituality, and Sarah Teasdale's poems take us to romanticism, with Adrienne Rich, her poems are political. They speak to the politics of womanhood and the politics of sexuality. Now, Adrienne came out as a lesbian in the 1970s when it was still incredibly dangerous to do so. And throughout her poems, we see her speak to the pain and suffering of women, particularly in the mid-20th century, when they couldn't open bank accounts or credit cards in their own names. Everything was owned by their husband, and women really did not have much control over their lives. So I do want to let you know before we get into some of the poems today that some of these will discuss heavier matters, including prostitution and sexual assault. Some of Adrienne's poems may even make you a little uncomfortable, and that is okay. Poetry, particularly poetry that says something, particularly political poetry, has a tendency to make us uncomfortable, and that's okay. Because the point of it is to draw things into your attention that we would otherwise prefer to ignore. So if any of these poems are triggering to you, this is your warning. And if they would simply make you uncomfortable, I invite you to sit with that discomfort and explore it. This lighter is nearly dead. I should not have brought it with me. There we go. Beautiful. The first joint of the day. This poem is called After 20 Years. Two women sit by a table. Light breaks unevenly on both of them. Their talk is a striking of sparks, which passers-by in the street observe as a glitter in the glass of that window. Two women in the prime of life. Their babies are old enough to have babies. Loneliness has been part of their story for 20 years, the dark edge of the clever tongue, the obscure underside of the imagination. It is snow and thunder in the street. While they speak, the lightning flashes purple. It is strange to be so many women eating and drinking at the same table. Those who bathed their children in the same basin, who kept their secrets from each other, walked the floors of their lives in separate rooms, and flow into history now as the women of their time, living in the prime of life, as in a city where nothing is forbidden and nothing permanent. This poem is called From the Prison House. Underneath my lids, another eye has opened. It looks nakedly at the light that soaks in from the world of pain, even when I sleep. Steadily, it regards everything I am going through and more. It sees the clubs and the rifle butts rising and falling. It sees detail not on TV, the fingers of the policewoman searching the cunt of the young prostitute. It sees the roaches dropping into the pan where they cook the pork in the house of D. It sees the violence embedded in the silence. This eye is not for weeping. Its vision must be unblurred, though tears are on my face. Its intent is clarity. It must forget nothing. Dialogue. She sits with one hand poised against her head, the other turning an old ring to the light. For hours our talk has beaten like rain against the screens, a sense of August and heat lightning. I get up, go to make tea, come back. We look at each other, and then she says, and this is what I live through over and over. She says, I do not know if sex is an illusion. I do not know who I was when I did those things, or who I said I was, or whether I willed to feel what I had read about, or who in fact was there with me, or whether I knew, even then, that there was doubt about these things. Translations. You show me the poems of some woman my age or younger, translated from your language. Certain words occur: enemy, oven, sorrow, enough to let me know she's a woman of my time. Obsessed with love, our subject. We've trained it like ivy to our walls, baked it like bread in our ovens, worn it like lead on our ankles. Watched it through binoculars as if it were a helicopter bringing food to our famine, or the satellite of a hostile power. I begin to see that woman doing things, stirring rice, ironing a skirt, typing a manuscript till dawn, trying to make a phone call from a phone booth. The phone rings unanswered in a man's bedroom. She hears him telling someone else, never mind, she'll get tired. Hears him telling her story to her sister, who becomes her enemy, and will, in her own time, light her own way to sorrow, ignorant of the fact this way of grief is shared, unnecessary, and political. Our next poem is called Living in the Cave. Reading the parable of the cave while living in the cave. Black moss deadening my footsteps, candles stuck on rock ledges weakening my eyes. These things around me with their daily requirements fill me, empty me, talk to me, warm me, let me suck on you. Every one of them has a plan that depends on me. Stalactites want to become stalagmites, veins of ore imagine their preciousness. Candles see themselves disembodied into gas and taking flight. The bat hangs dreaming of an airy world. None of them, not one, sees me as I see them. This poem is called Rape, and this is where the trigger warning is applied. There is a cop who is both prowler and father. He comes from your block, grew up with your brothers, had certain ideals. You hardly know him in his boots and silver badge on horseback, one hand touching his gun. You hardly know him, but you have to get to know him. He has access to machinery that could kill you. He and his stallion clop like warlords among the trash. His ideals stand in the air, a frozen cloud from between his unsmiling lips. And so, when the time comes, you have to turn to him. The maniac's sperm still greasing your thighs. Your mind whirling like crazy. You have to confess to him you are guilty of the crime of having been forced. And you see his blue eyes, the blue eyes of all the family whom you used to know, grow narrow and glisten. His hand types out the details and he wants them all, but the hysteria in your voice pleases him best. You hardly know him, but now he thinks he knows you. He has taken down your worst moment on a machine and filed it in a file. He knows or thinks he knows how much you imagined. He knows or thinks he knows what you secretly wanted. He has access to machinery that could get you put away, and if in the sickening light of the precinct, your details sound like a portrait of your confessor, will you swallow? Will you deny them? Will you lie your way home? Some poems are particularly heavy. That is one of those. And this is another one, although a shorter one. It's called Burning Oneself In. In a bookstore on the east side, I read a veteran's testimony. The running down for no reason of an old woman in South Vietnam in a U.S. Army truck. The heat wave is over. Lifeless, sunny, the east side rests under its awnings. Another summer, the flames go on feeding, and a dull heat permeates the ground of the mind. The burn has settled in as if it had no more question of its right to go on devouring the rest of a lifetime, the rest of history. Pieces of information like this one blow onto the heap. They keep it fed whether we will it or not. Another summer and another of suffering quietly in bookstores, in parks. However we may scream, we are suffering quietly. That's out. I'll get back to that. So this book was published, I believe, in 1973, and most of these poems were written in 1972. And whenever you read poetry, but particularly political poetry, you have to consider the time that it was written in. In the early 1970s were a particularly turbulent time in the US. You were only 3 years removed from the summer of 1969, which was incredibly chaotic. They were either still in Vietnam or had just pulled out of Vietnam. It was a very strange and chaotic time, much like our own. Our last poem today is poem number 4 from the section of the book called Meditations for a Savage Child. And each poem here starts with a snippet of a book. A book called The Wild Boy of Aveyron. So this poem starts with the section, "A hand with the will, rather than the habit of crime, had wished to make an attempt on the life of this child. Left for dead in the woods, he will have owed the prompt recovery of his wound to the help of nature alone." And then we move into the poem. In the 18th century, Infanticide reaches epidemic proportions. Old prints attest to it. Starving mothers, smothered babies in sleep. Abandoned newborns in sleet on the poorhouse steps, gin blurred, setting fire to the room. I keep thinking of the flights we used to take on the grapevine across the gully, littered with beer bottles where dragonflies flashed. We were 10, 11 years old, wild little girls with boyish bodies, flying over the moist, shadow-molted earths till they warned us to stay away from there. Later, they pointed out the Venetian blinds of the abortionist's house. We shivered. Men can do things to you, was all they said. Some poems leave you smiling and happy. Some poems leave you wistful and meditative, and some poems stick with you deep in your core. Adrienne Rich is one of those poets from the latter half of the 20th century that sticks with me in my core, and I am glad to be able to share her with you today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you rolled up, I would love to know what you smoked in the comment section below. Thank you for spending time with yourself, with me, and with some poetry. That's all I have for you today. Be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and have a wonderful day.